My name is Jim Hamilton. I am this year the co-chair, along with Sheila Hockhauser, of the Dorothy L. Thompson Civil Rights Lecture Series Committee. It's been a privilege serving in that capacity for this and actually the past 2 years. The Dorothy Thompson Civil Rights Lectures are sponsored by the Office of the Provost and a whole bunch of other departments and individuals who contribute money and, in the case of the committee, time to winnow through some ideas and then to bring people here and to make sure that we get the full benefit. In the case of the current lecturer, she will have been in 4 different classes talking with students over the course of today, tomorrow, and Friday. She will be lecturing and discussing on campus in addition to the Dorothy Thompson series. But I thought for some of you, you may not know anything at all about what the series is about, and I'm just going to very briefly say that. Dorothy Thompson was in the middle of her life, went back to law school and became an attorney for this university, drafted its first affirmative action policy, became its first affirmative action officer, served well all of those of us in academe who were struggling to figure out what the policy meant and how we could best comply with it. She did so with compassion, with wit, sometimes a rather savage wit, but always with her eye on making sure we understood that the goal was the implementation and the preservation of rights we all share because of our humanity, and that are then encoded into law and become what we call our civil rights. She was a great believer in not only the civil rights that were already acknowledged, but in looking to see how we could improve the lives of people by understanding what kinds of civil rights might actually be accorded to people who did not have them acknowledged at present. The lecture series was instituted upon her sudden and unexpected and very tragic death. The provost quite correctly saw that there was really but one way we could honor her memory, and that was to continue her legacy, which was to continue to bring forth before the academic community and the community at large in Manhattan the issues about civil rights that we continue to struggle with as a people. And it's in that spirit that we will be hearing a lecture this evening and discussing with our lecturer the ideas she brings to us. I'm going to introduce another member of the committee who's actually going to introduce our speaker. Professor Marlene Rosamond is a professor of philosophy at Kansas State University, and she will now do the honors.
Good evening, everybody. It's a real pleasure and a great honor to introduce Professor Susan Okin as our speaker tonight. I'll give you a little thumbnail sketch of her biography and tell her a little bit something impressionistic about her work, and then I'll yield the floor to Professor Okin herself. Professor Okin was born in New Zealand. She will not sound at all like a person born in Kansas, I can tell you that. She got a BA in history at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. She got an MPhil in politics at Oxford, and then a Ph.D. in government at Harvard. She taught at Vassar, Brandeis, Harvard, and she is now, and this is long, but she is now, the Marta Sutton Weeks Professor of Ethics in Society and Professor of Political Philosophy, Political Science at Stanford University. She has published 2 books that she wrote all by herself, so to speak. One is called Women in Western Political Thought. The other one is called Justice, Gender, and the Family. She's also written articles on various topics, including such a different topic as the ethics of nuclear deterrence. Much of her work has focused on criticisms of the Western political tradition, the Western political thought, both old and new, in terms of its ignoring of women's issues and thus contributing to injustice to women. Often these problems arise from theories of justice completely ignoring the private sphere, the sphere of the family, the personal sphere, and her point has often been that that's where often issues of injustice arise for women. More recently, she has done work on very controversial issues. She has argued that there's a real tension between feminist values on one hand and the value of respecting the values of other cultures on the other hand. The reason is quite simply that in cultures in general, Western or non-Western, the tradition has always been to be not particularly feminist, right? Feminism is a recent movement, and traditions tend to be oppressive of women and create various forms of injustice towards women. As a result, if we ask of ourselves that we respect the values embedded in all kinds of traditions, we come into conflict with values of equality for women and the rights of women. This work has resulted in a number of publications, including a book called Is Multiculturalism Bad for Women? Tonight she will be speaking about women and economic development. Her title is International Development and the Importance of Gender. And before I yield the floor to her, I want to say I know Professor Okin a little bit from my years in California, and besides being a very productive scholar who displays a real talent for being very down to earth and putting her finger on the spot. She's a very no-nonsense kind of thinker, in my view. She goes straight to the heart of the matter. She frequently said things about which you say, well, yeah, gosh, that's really true. I never thought of it that way, but that's really true, and it's really important. And so she's brought to light various very important issues about women's rights that you might have overlooked, but that are indeed extremely important. And now, without any further ado, let's welcome Professor Okin for her talk.
Thank you, Marlene. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you. It seems to have become fairly obvious in recent years that international development policies and the theories behind them have some bad flaws. Even though the percentage of the world's population that lives in dire poverty has decreased to some extent, the numbers of people living in extreme poverty, that is to say living on the equivalent of $1 a day or less, has grown in recent years. There also has been a serious problem. Obviously, this is partly caused by distribution problems within countries. It also has to do with the distribution of wealth amongst countries. And another thing that has failed to happen that people expected would have begun to happen by now is a real slowing of population growth. Has slowed some, but it hasn't slowed enough. Now, frequently, articles and discussions about redistributive issues on a global scale start out as if the world's population all just descended on the planet yesterday and happened to land in various places on its various continents and islands. It seems to be regarded often in academic argument as purely a matter of chance that some people live in countries with high standards of living and others in countries with low standards of living and with a great deal of poverty. Philosophers invent situations and create hypotheses about such situations, as that of the X's who live over here on this island with a lot of resources and the Y's who live over here on this island without many resources. And they often make arguments about whether the better off have any obligation to help the worse off. The peoples are assumed in some of these arguments to have had few or no previous connections to the point where the argument begins. Now, such arguments, when they are made, they have little relevance, I think, to the real world. After all, the world has a long and complex history. And I want to talk about one part of this history that has lasted into the present, and which I think has not had sufficient attention by theorists of development, and in particular I'm going to talk about economists, the way that they have neglected and largely ignored gender issues. They have, by and large, not paid attention to the different ways in which different societies in the world institutionalize and socialize their children into gender roles and gendered behavior and perpetuate these things through their customs and laws. And I think this is part of the reason why, not all of the reason by any means, but part of the reason why we have a lot of problems and there are flaws in the kinds of development policies that have been tried so far in the post-World War period mostly. So I'm going to talk then about how the neglect of issues of gender and misunderstandings about gender have affected international development. And I want to do this in three parts. First, I'm going to talk a bit about colonialism. And then I'd like to talk about the period of post-World War II development initiatives that are often known as the period of modernization theory and modernization policies. And then I want to talk about the policies of the last 2 decades or so that have been implemented by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank that are known as structural adjustment plans or policies. Now, all of these three phenomena are cases, the first, colonialism, and the structural adjustment policies have been much more coercive than the middle one, that is modernization. But all of them basically are policies that have been implemented on the less well countries by the more well-off countries of the world, on the third world by the more developed industrialized world. Okay, so first let's take a quick look back at that vast phenomenon called colonization. And I really mean by this, basically, of course, Latin America was earlier, parts of Asia earlier, but as far as sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia especially, are concerned, mostly a phenomenon of the 19th and the early 20th centuries. Now, the impetus behind colonialism had other motives than economic ones, such as national glory and sometimes missionary fervor. But amongst its most obvious motivations was the desire to expand markets for the manufactured goods of the European industrializing powers and later the United States, and to obtain the raw materials for manufacturing at the lowest possible prices in terms of resource extraction and labor. The colonized countries, especially those that were not settled by people from the European imperial powers, were governed in such a way and to such an extent as to maximize these economic gains for the industrializing nations. The colonized regions of the world, which at times included almost all of the world outside of Europe, with notable exceptions, such as Japan, for example, were successfully coerced by various means, from fraud sometimes to muskets on the other hand, to give up large aspects of their autonomy, their self-governingness, and often their lands and natural resources to the more industrialized world. They were typically prohibited from trading with other European nations, prevented in various ways from developing their own manufacturing sectors. When Egypt tried to do it at one time, she was very forcefully sanctioned by the European powers not to develop industry. They were required to restrict their trade and other economic activities in various ways so as to advantage the colonial power that had successfully claimed them as its possessions. Now, at risk of labeling myself as an octogenarian, I will confess that when I was a small child, my mother, who was a very education-minded woman, had a big map that she stuck up on the wall of my bedroom. And this map of the world had all of the British possessions colored red, and they really were called possessions, if you can believe it. It's sort of hard to believe now. It's not a very PC way to think, right? But anyway, not only this, they were all red, but they also had little portraits of all the people who had supposedly discovered them all around the edges. So all the Europeans who'd gone out and, as it were, found these possessions were honored on the map as well. Now, in addition to the often taking over of land and resources, colonialism involved a fair amount of coercive labor. There was slavery, obviously, was a major part of colonization and was not abolished within the British Empire, for example, till 1833. In fact, I recently met an Indian couple on a plane whose grandparents had been forcibly taken from India to Suriname in Latin America as slaves in the 1890s. Now, that really astonished me because, you know, we all were taught that slavery was abolished in the British Empire in 1833, but apparently it actually wasn't. Then there were the practice of indentured labor, where people would be taken from one colony to another, and then they would be required to pay off their fare by 3 or 5 years of virtually unpaid work. Then there were several other ways of getting people to work for very little and turning them into wage laborers. One of them was to impose poll taxes on people, which meant that if they had previously gained their subsistence from subsistence farming or the forests or whatever, they now had to work for wages because they had to pay this tax in currency. And another way of getting people to work for cheap, low wages was to take their land off them. And of course, this often was done too in many parts of the world. People who had been farmers had their land taken away, and then they had to be wage workers in the mines or the factories or whatever it was that the colonizers had set up. Now, as far as their internal governance was concerned, typically colonized countries were governed not only in the ways that, but also to the extent that their colonial rulers thought was necessary and convenient. That is to say, if their aim was, as it usually was, to extract material resources, get people to work for low wages, and to restrict their trading with other countries, then this was the extent to which the law was controlled. So example after example, when we look at once colonized countries, reveals that whereas the colonists enforced their own country's laws concerning things like criminal law, contracts, torts, and so on, they typically left standing and unchanged the colonized country's personal laws. That is to say, the laws that had to do with family, that had to do with marriage and divorce, that had to do with child custody, child support sometimes, and inheritance rights at times. Now, in some cases, the Europeans did impose their own laws concerning marriage on the indigenous peoples as well. For example, one of the few peoples in the world who are still subjected to mid-19th century Dutch divorce law are some parts of Indonesia. Makes sense, right? Strange thing going on in the modern world. At the beginning of the 21st century, we have mid-19th century Dutch divorce law in parts of Indonesia. But in many cases, the colonists introduced their own laws of family, marriage, and divorce only to apply to Europeans living in the colony. So in various countries, for example, I'll give some examples from sub-Saharan Africa, we find that English, Belgian, French, and German residents, people from those countries, could marry in accordance with the laws of their countries of origin. But these laws were not applied to the Africans, the indigenous Africans of the countries. In fact, in some cases, they were not allowed to be married according to the law of the European power. They were supposed to go ahead with their own customary marriage practices. Why didn't the colonists, in most cases, try to change these practices? Well, perhaps, I think, largely because, as I've suggested, they didn't need to. They didn't really care a whole lot about how the people married, divorced, what their rules of child custody were, or whatever, support after divorce, whatever. They didn't really care a whole lot. But perhaps also, at least in some cases, the personal laws were left alone so as not to cause trouble. Personal laws, laws about things like marriage, divorce, and children, are, after all, often closely influenced by some of the deepest-seated beliefs held by a people. Thus, there was little point in changing them in situations in which power and authority needed to be used sparingly, economically, as they did in the practice of colonialism. There was little reason to change them unless there were fairly compelling reasons to do so. For example, think of in the Christian marriage laws until not too long ago, I remember I think it was early in the 20th century, the prayer book got changed over to the different wording. but it used to be part of the Anglican marriage service, at least, Episcopalian marriage service, that wives would promise to obey their husbands. Now, this is, of course, closely tied with Scripture. It's tied with parts from St. Paul. It's also tied with the story of the creation of the book of Genesis, where Adam is told to be, Eve is told to be subject to her husband Adam. So this is a kind of core part of Christianity in its more orthodox and more traditional forms. Well, just as that's the case with Christianity, it's the case with many customary laws, and certainly was the case in many of the cultures that the Europeans colonized during the previous few centuries. Moreover, in colonies such as India and Pakistan, which of course were all once British India, and Palestine and some parts of Africa, there were different competing religious or cultural groups living within the same within the same country. And to try to make the personal laws of these people, which were highly diverse, more uniform would have been quite likely to cause serious disruption or to cause interreligious or intercultural conflict. So if this could be avoided by simply leaving the personal laws in the hands of the different customary groups or religious leaders, then it made sense for the Europeans to do this. However, this practice had long-term and very largely negative consequences for women in many, many parts of the world, because many of the laws that were in place at the time, the customs, the religious laws, were highly patriarchal. So many of the serious gender inequalities that exist in less developed countries today directly or indirectly result from this aspect of colonialism. The rest of the civil and criminal laws in these ex-colonized parts of the world have by and large changed with the times. In some cases, they were quite affected by the laws of the colonial period. In some cases, they have been radically changed since. But in many of the ex-colonies, which are now many of the less industrialized countries of the world, the personal laws of marriage, divorce, child custody, and so on are in accordance with religious and or customary law pretty much as it was at the time the country was colonized. It's kind of fixed in time. Now, since often the indigenous peoples were basically stripped of their culture in many other respects, the colonists by and large denigrated the indigenous cultures, this personal or customary law came to symbolize the culture and therefore to have immense significance. So the relation of wives to husbands, the relation to men to women in general, relationships between parents or children, all of these things came to have more significance than they might otherwise have had because they were the only part of the culture that was kept by many people who were colonized. Now also, of course, the domestic sphere of life is where a great deal of culture is transmitted. So keeping the laws and customs of this domestic sphere true to the culture was often considered particularly important. As I said before, though, often, in most cases, customary law or orthodox versions of religion are highly patriarchal. I don't have time to elaborate this in detail here. I've written about it quite a lot. But suffice it to say that a lot of orthodox religious and customary personal law is aimed at placing men in control of women and placing the old in control of the young. And in particular, they want to control, these laws are aimed at controlling women's sexuality and reproductive powers, and often women's labor power as well. Only when women aged, and in many cases, only if they were the mothers of sons and then aged, did they come to have any power. Some of the specific customs that exist in various parts of the world that were practiced so as to try to ensure this result include the marriage of girls at very young ages, arranged or coerced marriage, the explicit subordination of wives to their husbands, polygyny, that is to say many wives, one husband, male preference in inheritance, the absence of divorce, or else divorce only at the behest of the man, only if the man wants it, and the lack of any responsibility of men to support their wives after divorce. Now, the more orthodox versions of almost all of the religions of the world, certainly including Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, include at least some of these marital customs, and some of them include many of them. So the effects for women of the, as it were, fossilization of these cultural or religious laws in many parts of the world has been, in many cases, nothing short of disastrous for women. It's not necessarily that the colonized countries were more patriarchal than those who colonized them. It's that the customs of the former, of the colonized, were often frozen in time at the time of the colonization. And just as an example, I want to bring up a case that has become quite famous. It's a case of an Indian Muslim woman whose name was Shabano. She was summarily divorced by her husband during the 1980s. After 40 years of marriage, I think she was 63 at the time of the divorce, he just said, you know, I divorce you, and that was it. In accordance with the Islamic law that applied to her, that applied to the couple, he owed her no maintenance, no support after the first few months of the divorce. Then she was to be left to supposedly her family, but given that she was 63, what was she going to, she didn't have much of her own family of birth left. She was reduced to penury, and since she had no recourse within the Muslim personal law, which rules over Muslims in India, she and other people on her behalf took her husband to court under the civil law because it was claimed that he was making her a vagrant. So the civil law said that you couldn't make somebody vagrant, be a beggar, so therefore that was how they took him to court. And he was found guilty of making her a vagrant and appealed the conviction, and the appeal went all the way up to the high courts of India. His appeal was on the basis that he, as a Muslim, had the right of religious freedom to have his personal affairs regulated only by the Muslim courts. And he said, this is my personal affair. I've divorced this woman. I don't owe her any support. You can't make me pay it. So it became a religious cause célèbre in India. It caused a lot of discomfort amongst many of the Indian elites about the effects of personal law on women. And unfortunately, the Hindu majority in India used this prominent case as an excuse to criticize the Muslims. They said, you know, oh, look, they've got bad personal law. In fact, the Hindu personal law isn't much better, but it got turned into a case of, you know, theirs is worse than mine. So it became a cause célèbre of communalism, which is the term that is used for the differences of religions and the religious groupings in India. In the long run, 10 years after the court case was first brought, the High Court decided in Shabano's favor. They said, yes, she should have this support. Now, in a tragic twist of irony, this woman, who was by this time 73 years old, had by this time been so psychologically battered and damaged by the whole experience, and also so pressured by some of the leaders of the Muslim community, that she renounced the court's award of support to her. She said, I, Shabano, as a Muslim, reject this ruling because I don't think it should be handed down by the civil courts. So she preferred to resort to what her religious law gave her at this point in the case, which was basically reliance on charity. Now, I hope that from what I've said, it's obvious that in innumerable respects, most of the world's now less industrialized countries were deeply affected by the colonization that they underwent at the hands of Europe and later on in the process, the United States, over the centuries. The women of these countries, though, were particularly affected and in a lasting way, as I have explained. It's not, of course, that the colonies didn't benefit at all. In some cases, they did benefit. They benefited from things like the building of railroads, the transfer of modern technology, the introduction sometimes of domesticated animals and plants. But at the same time, vast amounts of their resources and labor power were expropriated by the more industrialized countries. Probably the worst aspect of colonialism is the loss of autonomy that it left. These countries lost their capacity to govern themselves and order their own future and their own social engagement. But the economic effects were quite serious as well. The industrialized countries were able to expropriate lots of raw material and labor, of course, which helped them with their own process of modernization. After World War II, though, there was a great deal of rethinking about the whole issue of colonialism. People questioned the moral justifiability of colonialism on the part of the colonial powers, and there was considerable resistance on the part of many of the remaining colonized peoples. So, as you all probably know, very soon after World War II, India rid itself of British domination, and one by one, most of the colonized countries of Africa and Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, and the Pacific either fought their way to independence or in some cases gained it more peacefully. Now, the next waves of European and North American influence they were to experience, as I said, came in a somewhat less coercive form, but they still came as strong influences. They came in the form of development policy and development theory. So I want now to just take a look at what was probably the most influential and prominent example of development theory and policy, and have a look at how some of the ways in which it missed the boat, as it were, on gender issues. It didn't do as much direct harm probably as colonialism, but it certainly missed a lot of opportunities. Well, when most political scientists, economists, or sociologists of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s asked the question, why are countries of the Third World, as it came to be called in the Cold War period, why are they less developed than those of the First and Second Worlds? They tended to answer, because they haven't modernized. The problem is they need to modernize. Now, some people didn't think this was the answer. Some of them gave an answer that was more along the lines of what I've been saying about colonialism. That is to say, they said a lot of the reason for the lack of industrialization and modern development of these countries was that they'd been colonized and that their labor power and their resources had been extracted from them to a large extent. What these people said was that the development of the few richer countries had happened at the expense of the countries that were now, by this time, less industrialized. These people weren't taken very seriously, and I think it's one of these cases where I think Foucault's power as knowledge and Marx's idea about the ruling ideas of the ruling class actually is a good example of that, because dependency theory, I think, makes a lot of sense, but it was kind of scoffed at, laughed off the table. They said, oh, those are just Marxists talking, or they're just Latin Americans. We don't need to take any notice of them. And, you know, to be a Marxist and a Latin American in some circles of academia would probably, you know, doubly discredit you for one reason or another. But the reason, I think, the main reason that dependency theory didn't take on was because it was not at all palatable to the elites of the more industrialized countries to acknowledge that they had in part caused the lesser development of many of the other parts of the world by extracting a lot of their resources, their labor power, and by, as it were, kind of sending them on a different path. Anyway, it's not dependency theory that I want to focus on right now, it's modernization theory. It was then pretty much hegemonic. It wiped contesting theories off the table, and it claimed that for the less developed parts of the world to become better off economically, which was the only kind of better off that they really cared about, they needed to become much more like the industrialized world. What did this mean? Well, it meant, and this was explicitly argued, that their people needed to become less attached to their traditional cultures and beliefs. They needed to become more rational. They needed to accept and to be trained in modern science. They needed to be ready to move geographically, especially from rural to urban areas. They also needed, it was said, to think more in terms of nuclear than extended families. The extended family was thought of as an obstacle to development. It prevented people from being sufficiently mobile. They needed to become punctual. They needed to think, they needed to expect to work according to schedules and continuously, rather than thinking of work as something that was seasonal or not, you know, you could decide from day to day whether it was a day to work or a day not to work. as some of the modernization theorists were quite explicit, they thought that the peoples of the less industrialized world needed, in essence, to develop all the virtues of a modern factory worker. If all the peoples of the world could just be like modern factory workers, the world would take off. Now, along with this modernization theory came macroeconomic theories of development that prevailed almost entirely unchallenged in the related disciplines in the United States. And more importantly, almost unchallenged in the world's largest financial institutions, that is, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, at least until the beginning of the 1990s. It was not until the beginning of the 1990s that the World Bank in particular really started not to just focus on industrialization, high technology, economic growth, and started to think more in terms of the kinds of development that might suit different places differently, that was more contextual, that was more attuned to local needs, and so on. Such theories, the modernization theories, measured the success or lack of success of a development policy only in terms of economic growth. And they measured economic growth only in terms of per capita gross national product. Well, what does this slightly cryptic term mean? It means you add up everything, all the transactions, the financial transactions that take place in a country, everything that passes through the marketplace, that all gets added up. Then you have the gross national product, you divide it by the number of people in the country, and you have the per capita gross national product. Now, during this whole period, the macroeconomic theories that went along with modernization, people believed that only when you had continual economic growth, only when the GNP per capita was growing, did you have development. And that was what was needed for the whole world. So the projects and the programs and the loans and the economic aid that were delivered from the less, to the less by the more developed world were aimed at economic growth, primarily through industrialization on the one hand and making agriculture more high-tech on the other hand. And large amounts of money were spent during these decades, from about the 1950s to the 1980s, on large-scale development projects such as dams. It was thought if you had dams and large-scale irrigation, if you had high-tech energy development projects and things like that, this would lead to the best development. Now, like colonialism before it, this new mode of intervention in the less industrialized world did have some good effects. Neither of them was all bad. In fact, life expectancies increased and infant and maternal mortality decreased in many countries for several decades due to the adoption of modern healthcare methods as well as to a generally increasing standard of living. But there are large problems with some of the central assumptions of the neoclassical economics that lies behind modernization theory. One of them is the assumption that the best measure of material well-being is the growth of per capita GNP. Another is the way that GNP is measured, which is by, as I said, adding all the monetary transactions that take place in a society together. Now, that the first is misleading, that you have to measure it by the growth of per capita GNP, I think is fairly easily illustrated. We can see by one simple illustration, although there are plenty more, that how people are doing, how are people doing in a country is not necessarily closely related to per capita gross national product. The GNP of the United States is about 10 times that of Costa Rica. Yet life expectancy, which is a fairly good measure, only one measure, but a fairly good measure of how people are doing in a society, how long can they expect to live, is only 1 year less in Costa Rica than it is in the United States of America. Well, how could this be so? One reason it is that per capita gross national product tells us nothing about how the product is distributed amongst all the people. It could be distributed equally to all of them, or it could be distributed all to the top 20% with very little for the people in the bottom 20%. That won't make any difference. because all GNP per capita means is that you've taken the GNP and you've divided it by the number of people to get the average. You haven't found out how it's distributed. So what did the early modernization theorists think about this? Well, they thought that economic development, as they defined it, would lead to greater equality. They explicitly wrote this in their arguments. They thought that it would lead to greater equality both among the different countries of the world and also within the different countries. They thought economic growth would bring with it both of these things. Now, they turned out to be wrong, at least so far, and it's several decades later now. Even where GNP per capita has risen markedly, in many cases, inequality has actually increased. The gap between the rich and the poor has grown. This has happened within many of the more and the less industrialized of the world's countries over the past few decades. And at the same time, economic inequality amongst countries has also grown, with the richer countries becoming increasingly better off, and some of the poorer countries actually, relatively speaking, becoming worse off and getting to a state of very little growth at all. Per capita GNP then tells us nothing about whether it's a small wealthy elite that has all of the resources and all of the income, and the vast majority of the people are living in penury, or whether they are distributed far more equally. Likewise, a growth in per capita GNP tells us nothing at all about how the society uses its resources. One of the reasons that Costa Rica has a life expectancy of 75 years as opposed to 76 in the United States is that the country has no military. So a large part, a much greater proportion of its public spending is devoted to education and to health care than is the case in the United States. So long as one focuses on measuring the growth of GNP alone, one knows little about how the people of a country are actually doing, how are they actually thriving. Yet apart from a brief period in the early 1970s under McNamara, it wasn't until the 1990s that the World Bank, which is by far the largest development agent in the world, seriously began to take notice of this and to start thinking about development in terms of basic human well-being of the people in the countries. So up till that time, many development projects, especially large-scale ones like dams, on which most development funds were spent until about a decade ago, may have contributed to the growth of GNP in cases, but they may also have actually detracted from the quality of life of many of the people, or even most of the people in the country. As one West African woman once said to me when I was at a meeting at the World Bank, sometimes the project is evaluated as successful even though the people have died. Now that's an extreme example, but you get the point. How the people are doing often is not what people go out to evaluate when they go to look at a project. Now there was another very real problem with modernization theory, and this is the one directly related to the main subject of my talk tonight, that is gender. In 1970, that is 31 years ago, an economist called Esther Bostrup published a book that's called Women's Role in Economic Development. She was a Danish development economist, and she had noticed something that until very recently, 30 years later, had not gained the recognition it, I think, has long deserved in development circles. What Bostrup pointed out was that the development programs and development theories that the global north was promoting in other countries were ignoring, they were either mistaking or they were neglecting issues having to do with gender. They didn't take any account of the different social and economic roles of men and women in different parts of the world. Instead, the economists, the sociologists, and the political scientists who developed these programs and theories, almost all of whom were themselves men, but who seemed to have been very untouched by the nascent feminism that was then happening in the United States, they seemed to assume, at best, that social relations between the sexes in the faraway lands about which they were theorizing were just the same as they were in the United States or in Europe, or else they thought that they were in accordance with some fantasy of what they were like, the economists or political scientists' fantasy of what they were like in their own countries. So they assumed, for example, that men earned money and women kept house, that women and their children were economically dependent on the children's fathers, that men worked and women didn't work. Now, because of these assumptions, they geared their development programs mainly, sometimes exclusively, towards men. Now, as Bostrup pointed out very clearly, these assumptions were badly askew in many parts of the world. I mean, she thought they were askew even in the first world countries, but they were very badly askew. In many parts of the world, as she had learned from going there and looking at what people did, as well as reading lots of books and articles, women did the great majority of the work outside of their homes, as well as all of the work inside their homes. While the work that men had traditionally done, which included a major part of men's work, for example, in certain parts of Africa, was hunting and fighting wars. And these things had been massively disrupted, sometimes completely obliterated by colonialism. So in many parts of the world then, there was no clear distinction between earning men and dependent women, since often fathers and mothers were both doing various kinds of work. Women were doing a great deal of it outside of the home as well as inside of the home. And in many cultures, they were both expected to provide for different aspects of their children's support. There might be, mothers should bring in the food, but fathers should pay for education or school uniforms or something. I mean, there were different kinds of obligations on different people. Now, in particular, Bostrup noticed that in sub-Saharan Africa, most of the farming was done by women, while the land that they farmed and might have use rights to farm was usually owned or controlled by the men. Okay, so we need to have a look at, wait a sec. Okay. What the assumptions were that were made by economists that led to their not really being able to cope with these other parts of the world. In fact, the mistakes that they made about their own countries got magnified when they took them to other countries and tried to apply them there. One of the assumptions that is made within most economic theory, and certainly all of it until very recently, is that work that is not paid work has no economic value. Now, since economics aspires to be a science, as most of the social sciences aspire to be, unfortunately, it tries to be as theoretically sparse and as quantitative as possible. Now, this means that if something's not easily measured or quantifiable, economists want to ignore it. They don't want to have to take account of it. So anything that doesn't have a market price is very hard for economists to process and to measure. So they don't count it. They don't count labor or productivity that is not paid as having any economic value. That is to say, it doesn't count, for example, as part of the GNP per capita. You don't count unpaid labor when you're counting up the so-called, the growth of the country then. This means that all of the work that is typically done by wives and mothers, sometimes by men too, but is typically done by women, in bearing and raising children, in cleaning house and clothes, in cooking, in volunteer work in the community, and in many countries in carrying fuel and water, and often other goods, this does not count economically. It has no value. Also, until fairly recently, economists didn't take any notice of subsistence farming. Now they try to find ways of dealing with subsistence farming, since it actually is, I don't know whether it's more of the world's productive labor than housework and childcare, but it's certainly, in many countries, it's a major part of what actually goes on. But for a long time, they didn't count subsistence farming. Why not? Because it didn't enter into the market and come back out. Nobody sold the goods. They grew them and they ate them. So they didn't count for economists because they never got turned into money. You couldn't measure them. Anyway, two examples should show how differently we would look at things if we didn't make this assumption that economists make about unpaid labor. If all of the homemakers in the United States, and I'll call them she because they're usually women, almost invariably, but not quite, Things are changing a bit, thank goodness. Anyway, if all of the homemakers in the United States were to wake up one morning and each of them was to go into the house next door and do that family's housework and get paid for it and then go home so that everybody would move over. They got paid, then they went back home. The gross national product would go like this. It would suddenly, billions, thousands of billions of dollars would be added to the gross national product. But no more work would have been done. Another example. There was an economist-led study of breastfeeding, the costs and benefits of breastfeeding children. I can't remember which country that it was, but it was a sub-Saharan African country. They were looking at breastfeeding as opposed to feeding the children formula and trying to figure out the costs and benefits. So for the benefits, they counted the nutritional and health benefits in terms of the height and weight and resistance to infectious diseases and things of the children. These were all measurable. In terms of the costs, they counted the costs of the formula and the bottles and nothing else. They didn't count the breastfeeding as having any cost. Women's time was costless. Women's breasts, well, what else are they going to do with them? You know, they don't have a value. So they didn't count any of that. So even though anyone who has breastfed a child knows that it can take a number of hours out of the day and a lot of caloric expenditure, which after all the economists could have measured, they didn't even measure that. But it takes a lot of energy and time, but none of that got counted in the study. So obviously they came out with the conclusion that breastfeeding was a great deal better in cost-benefit terms, and maybe it is, but they didn't measure it. They didn't really know because they neglected a great deal of the costs. Now, it's not surprising that the assumption that unpaid labor has no economic value has led to some very bad mistakes on the part of development economists. And it has led, I think, to enormously bad mistakes by powerful institutions, such as the IMF and the World Bank, even when they have really been trying to do good in the world. I think they just have missed the boat, largely because of all these gender issues. Another equally disastrous assumption that economists make is that households or families can be treated as if they were a single individual. Now, as I'll explain, this is even more of a problem in the less industrialized world than it is in the industrialized world. For a couple of decades now, feminist economists have been challenging this assumption and saying you can't treat a whole family or household as though it's a single individual. Why would economists want to do this? Well, they want to treat households as individuals because they really only know how to deal with individual economic actors. They don't really know how to deal with something like a household where something might be happening inside it. So the household has typically been made into a black box, that is to say, you can't see inside it, and the black box acts like an individual. Now, within economics, individuals are assumed to be rational, self-interested actors. They act in their own self-interest. Now, how can you make a household into an individual actor? Well, for a while they just said, let's assume that the household is an individual actor. But after a while, some of them started to say, well, you know, that's a bit of a problematic assumption. We better look at that again. And one of the explanations that has been the most popular for why one should treat the household as a single individual is that of Gary Becker, who wrote a book about the economics of the family. And he argues, basically, that the reason you could treat a household as a single individual is because altruism operates within it. He says you can assume that there is a household head, and he calls him he, and the other adult member of the household she, although he says it could be either way. But he says this head of the household acts like a perfect altruist. This head of the household does not act in his family like a self-interested economic actor. He acts totally the reverse of that. He acts as though the interests of every other member of his family are equal with his own. That is to say, the expenditure of labor by his wife or one of his children is as important to him in every calculation he makes as his own expenditure of labor. The leisure of his wife is as important to him as his own leisure, and so on. Now, few of us would want to disagree with the fact that it would be very nice if families did operate that way, but I think few of us would be willing to say that we can assume that the family just acts that way. After all, we know that many fathers, after separation, refuse to pay child support and don't want to have anything to do with keeping their children economically. So it seems a bit much to assume that within the family unit, they're going to act like perfect altruists and want everybody in every respect to be treated as having interests as important as their own. In many third world settings, these assumptions about households can turn out to be even further off base and therefore than they are when we use them to talk about the developed world. And so policies based on them are less likely to succeed. And I want to look at a couple of examples here. At least one example. There was 3 different development projects between 1966 and 1980 tried to irrigate, to high technologize rice growing in a country in West Africa called the Gambia. Now, it's a small country. It's one of those ones out on the West Cape of Africa. 3 attempts were made by the Chinese government, the Taiwanese government, and the World Bank. And all 3 of them failed to produce the amount of extra rice that they thought would be produced by their irrigation policies and their programs. Now, they failed largely because each of them directed the initiatives, the control of the land, the credit, and the other aspects, the inputs, the training, the fertilizers, they directed it all to the men of the Gambia. And they each assumed, when they did this, that the men would have at their access, they would have access to the labor of their wives and children. So they assumed that, the rice would be grown, and in heavy-duty labor time, like harvest time, the rest of the family would come on board and help. Now, what they failed to take account of was the fact that gender roles in the Gambia are quite different than they are in economic theory or than they are in the economists' fantasies about their own countries. In the Gambia, for a start, 71% of the women are in the labor force. They make up at least half of the agricultural workforce already, doing 60% of the visible agricultural work. That is what's counted. They also have primary responsibility for processing the food grains, which can take up to 6 hours a day for a family. They collect the fuel and water, they clean the house, they cook, and they do all the other domestic work. They also have an average of 6.4 children per woman, one of the highest fertility rates in the world. Now, not surprisingly, these women work from 5 or 6 in the morning until 9 or 10 at night. Moreover, none of the development policy experts seem to have noticed that the women who had different obligations to their family according to the culture of their country, it was the women who were the primary rice growers of the Gambia. Not only were they the primary rice growers, not the men, but they did it either on communally owned land or on land that they had cleared themselves, and therefore they wanted to spend their labor on their rice growing efforts. So when these development experts came in and put the men in charge of the irrigated fields and said, here's your fertilizers, here's your land, here's your irrigation system, the women weren't going to go and work on those fields. They didn't owe anything to the men. They weren't free labor in the men's household, somehow just ready to be used. For one thing, they were working from 6 in the morning till 10 at night anyway, so they couldn't do any more work. And for another thing, it wasn't part of their work according to the culture. Their work was to work on their land and to take care of all the other things they took care of. So the free labor didn't exist. When heavy needing labor time came around, the women and children didn't appear, and the projects didn't work the way they were supposed to. So what the economists could have learned if they'd actually taken the trouble to go to the place and look at what the people did and figure out their culture, it didn't work. And as it happened, more than half of the children of this country were at that time dying by the age of 5 from malnutrition. And a large part, ironically, it was a World Bank report that argued that it was largely because of the overwork and the malnutrition of the mothers that the children were dying in such numbers. For one thing, the women were malnourished during pregnancy, so the children had low birth rate weights, and then the mothers were too exhausted and overworked to feed the children properly, and they often died of preventable diseases. Now, this didn't change with all these fancy projects. Quickly to the third issue. I want to talk a little bit about what's been happening most recently, because I think the word structural adjustment are words that are much more known in the less developed parts of the world than in our own country, and I think all of us really need to understand what happened here. This is the third time that I think the more developed world has made bad mistakes having to do with gender about the less developed world. What happened here was this. What we see as globalization, the integration of all the economies of the countries of the world, companies from our country investing in other countries all over the globe, this integration that's taken place, the amount of trade that's going on in the world, is not something that just happened. It happened not quite like colonialism, but like it in certain respects. It happened somewhat coercively. At least a large part of it happened somewhat coercively. What happened? Well, in their quest for modernization, many of the less industrialized countries of the world took out loans. They became debtor nations. They wanted to build industry. They wanted to become modern. They needed to borrow money to do it. During the 70s, because of the two oil price shocks, the big increases in oil prices, they got even more in debt for two reasons. One was that the price of oil went up, and if they wanted to industrialize, they had to pay these higher oil prices. But the other reason was that big international banks, suddenly flooded with oil money, were pushing loans. And in the 70s, they were pushing loans at low interest rates, variable rate loans, but in the early 70s, they had low interest rates. So a lot of less developed countries got heavily in debt in the early 70s. And then, as those of us who are old enough to remember can really remember, during the 70s, interest rates went like this. By the end of the 70s, a mortgage interest rate was like 15, 16%. Now, if you were a less developed country who'd borrowed money at, 6 or 7% in 1972, and it now was at 16% in 1979 or 1980, you were in serious trouble. So we have a large number of less developed countries with serious debt problems. They can't pay back the debt. Not only this, but they can't even pay the interest on the debt. They're really, really in trouble. So the international agencies, which are much more affected by the wishes of the industrialized nations than they are by the wishes of the less industrialized nations, because the former are more powerful, these institutions required certain things of these countries in order to agree to help them with their debt. They said, we will help you with your debt. We will restructure your debt, which is why it's called structural adjustment. We will restructure your debt. In some cases, they got the interest rate lowered. Often they got the interest payments stretched out more into the future. They said, we'll do this, but you, on your part, have to agree to certain things. Now, this was, by this time, the early 80s, when these policies were being put into place. It was the years of Reagan and Thatcher, and the free market should rule over everything. What was being told to these countries was basically that they could restructure their debt and they would be helped if they went in a thoroughly free market direction. They were told, you must take away all import controls so that you just let in the goods from other countries. You must stop subsidizing your infant industries, because often that's how countries build up industries. Stop subsidizing, that's a bad thing to do. You must let your currency float in the free market, not set it at certain rates. And you must balance your country's budgets. Notably, they were not told, as far as I can tell, and I have to do more sort of careful looking at some of these, they were not told to cut back on their arms spending, interestingly enough. And I think that's very interesting because, of course, the industrialized countries had an interest in the less industrialized ones continue to buying arms, because who did they buy them from? They bought them from Britain, France, the US, Germany, and so on. They didn't buy them from each other, by and large. They were not told to cut back on arms spending, and the rationale for this was that it was an infringement on national sovereignty. What they were told to cut back on, or at least left to cut back on, because it was most of the rest of their budgets, was healthcare, education, and social services. So in many of the least well-off countries in the world in the 1980s and the 1990s, governments were cutting back on public spending on education, healthcare, any form of social services. Now, of course, this was in line with the policies of the Reagan and Thatcher governments that you shouldn't have a welfare state, and these things should be left up to the market, and if the poor are poor, then, you know, they just have to suffer. But these countries were told, you can't get your debt restructured unless you do these things. So they really didn't have any choice. One thing that I can't understand is why was that not regarded as an infringement of their sovereignty? I mean, why could we require them to cut back on their education and social services? Why could the World Bank and the IMF say this, but not say to them, you've got to cut back on arms spending? Anyway, even when these policies were first proposed in the early 1980s, they were critiqued very carefully and well by feminist scholars of development who wrote books saying, look, these policies are going to be catastrophic. They're going to really undermine a lot of the things that, you know, if we're interested in development of the less developed parts of the world, we want to foster. After all, modernization theory had said you should have education. Everybody should have access to education. It had also said, you know, have science and modern healthcare programs. But now countries were being told, no, let these things be done by the market. And, for example, were being told to charge user fees so that, for example, for a child to go to public school in some part of Africa, they would be required to pay fees. Now, given the levels of economic development and the amount of money that was left in many households in these countries, that was going to cut out a lot of children's education. It was going to mean that fewer children would actually be sent to school. And in many cultures, when fewer children are sent to school, who is it that doesn't get sent? It's the girls. So in many cases, the education of girls specifically was being discouraged indirectly by the world's foremost financial agencies during the 1980s and the 1990s. Now, there are a lot of studies now that show that these structural adjustment programs have had very deleterious effects on some of the poorest people in the world. And one of the things that I'm trying to do right now is to try to figure out what kind of correlations there are between the timing of the various adjustment policies and the timing of this kind of regrowth of inequality in the world. But I do know that from 1980 on, even measured in terms of the traditional measure of per capita gross national product, the less developed countries of the world almost stayed stagnant. They grew almost nothing through the 1980s and a large part of the 1990s. So even in terms of the traditional measurement, which of course doesn't measure everything, they were not doing well. And this was the very thing that the structural adjustment programs were supposed to do. They were supposed to make economic growth happen. Well, it hasn't happened yet, and it's already 20 years later. So you might say, well, how long do you have to wait to see if this works? Well, actually, the World Bank has realized in many cases that it's not working. They've started in the last 8 years or so, particularly since Wolfenson, the new president, has been in charge. They have started to pay much more attention to abject poverty. They've started to pay much more attention to gender, although even there I think they have a long way to go. And they have started to say, in some cases, look, we'll let you kind of start again and have a fresh start. So some countries like Uganda, the World Bank is pulling back from the structural adjustment programs and putting much less restrictive programs into place and trying to help them. Well, I just want to stop on a kind of upbeat note of suggestions. What do the world's richer countries, and especially the more affluent people in the richer countries, owe to the poorer countries and the less well-off people in them? I think we owe a great deal, and this history, this whole history from colonialism through modernization, through the last 20 years of these structural adjustment programs, I think can help us to understand why we really have to do something. We can't just stop and, see that many, many people are dying every day in Africa. I think 3,000 people a day are dying of AIDS, HIV in Africa, largely brought on. It's through heterosexual contact, and it has a lot to do with the lower status of women, which, as you can see, has a lot to do with the economic policies that have been pursued by powerful people and agencies in the world. The other thing that's really been a disaster from this is the lesser education of girls. Now, it's been known for a long time that many things are positively correlated with girls' education. If you give girls education, their children are better fed and better nourished, and better taken care of, and they have the number of children they want, much more than if they don't have education. Nobody quite knows what it is about girls' education that enables them, when they grow up to be women, to control their own fertility and have just the number of children they want and no more. But there is a definite correlation. This has been known since at least the 1970s, and yet for 20 years now, we've been putting these policies into practice on the less developed world that have been inhibiting girls' education, that have actually been causing some girls to be pulled out of school because it costs too much, and so on. So I think that, you know, as a country, we certainly need to urge the World Bank to stop the structural adjustment. And actually, I mean, I don't think it's at all too much to ask at this point that we just simply forgive the debt. We could find the money to forgive the debt of the less developed countries of the world if we chose that as a high priority. We don't have to continue to spend money on arms the way we do, for example. We don't have to continue some of the elective spending we do. We could say, look, there's a disaster out there and we have partly caused it, so let's do something about it. I think forgiving of the debt and pulling back from all these policies of, you know, you have to let the market reign free and it will solve everything. I think 20 years is long enough for us to say, look, that really didn't work too well. And particularly, it's making a lot of women and children suffer in many parts of the world because gender and women's work have been so discounted. So let's do something about it. Thank you.